Good evening and welcome to tonight's Whiskey Exchange tasting. It's Thursday. It's time for us to try some interesting things as we do every single week at the moment. Yes, tonight we are joined all the way from Scotland by Brian Kinsman from Glenfiddich. Brian, hello.
Hello.
Excellent.
How are you?
Right. Good to see you. Oh, wait a minute. I made it so people can't see you. There we go. People can see you again. Brilliant. That's what I was after. Anyway, how are you doing this evening?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's not a bad night here. I'm actually not in Speyside tonight. I'm down in just outside Glasgow at the main William Grant headquarters, which is where we have our blending room.
Excellent. So, just kick us off. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today as the guy behind loads of stuff that William Grant's doing, including, of course, Glenfiddich?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have now worked at William Grant & Sons for nearly 24 years. And for the last, just nearly coming up for 11 years, actually, I've been the master blender and malt master at Glenfiddich. So I came into the business back in 1997 as a chemist, worked at the grain distillery for 3 or 4 years, doing various things in terms of chemical analysis, sensory analysis, the kind of backup to David Stewart at the time. And I was very, very fortunate to be around in the business at a time when David was looking for effectively an apprentice. So in the early 2000s, I started working with David, and we really worked side by side for 8 or 9 years, up until the point where he didn't quite retire. David's still not quite retired, so David's 70, I won't tell you his age, but David's coming up for 60 years with the company, and he is still around working on Balvenie, but in 2009 I took over all the other brands that we do, all the other spirit brands. So basically from here in this room, I manage the quality of the various brands across the whole William Grant & Sons portfolio, and clearly tonight we're going to focus exclusively on Glenfiddich.
Excellent. Because one of the things about Glenfiddich is, how do you guys phrase it? Is it the 12-year-old is the world's biggest single malt, the biggest selling single malt, or?
Yes, I get slightly lost because it changes a wee bit, but I believe Glenfiddich is back to being the largest single malt brand in the world. And as I say, it changes over the years. The thing I'm a lot more focused on, obviously, we want to be successful, we want to sell. The kind of strapline, the world's most awarded, is a big thing for us in terms of making sure, and hopefully when you see this tonight, that everything we do is of the highest quality. So that's clearly the area I'm much more focused in, rather than necessarily the volume that we're doing.
And that's the thing. While people really know Glenfiddich 12-year-old, especially being this iconic whiskey that's found all over the world, it's not the only thing you guys do. You have this whole range of whiskies, and including one of the things we're going to look into this evening is the more experimental side of what you guys do at the distillery. And from having had a chat with you and various other folks over the years, I know there's always some stuff hiding around in the warehouse, another project sort of like ready to go or being looked into. But shall we start off with the whiskey then?
Yeah.
Talking about the experimental whiskies, what's the first one we're going to be jumping into today?
Yeah, so we're going to start with the Glenfiddich experimental IPA cask. So it was probably about 4 years ago or so, we launched what was called the experimental series, and it was really to try to give us a chance to showcase and give us a platform for exactly what you talked about. We have a warehouse literally full of experiments. We're a family-owned business. We're an inquisitive whiskey business, if you like, and we're very, very encouraged to experiment and try things. And there's lots and lots and lots of experiments in the warehouse that we will never ever bottle. We'll never bottle them because they're as much about learning, they're as much about understanding, maturation, and developing all the different possibilities in terms of flavour. And they're not necessarily being developed for flavour, but obviously, for release. But many of them are also really good, and it's hard when you've got a global brand with such a strong 12, 15, 18 traditional core. It's hard to really experiment and to suddenly bring out small limited editions. So the experimental series was developed as a platform for us to really be able to do that. And the very first experiment was IPA cask. So it's a no age statement Glenfiddich, and essentially I create the vatting and in really simple terms fill it into cask that previously held IPA beer and leave it there for anywhere between 3, 4, maybe 5 months occasionally until I feel that the balance is right, where it's got nuances, hints of some of the notes that you would expect from the IPA cask, as well as that core Glenfiddich character. The one thing I'd say is it's not as straightforward as it sounds, because ultimately when we started to make this product, we had to go right back to first principles and actually make the IPA in the first place. Because if you simply take an IPA beer matured in cask, you don't necessarily get the flavour transfer that I'm looking for. So we created, in collaboration with a brewery up in Speyside, we created almost like an IPA on steroids, a really big, bold, very hoppy, very dry, intense beer, on the basis that some of those beautiful hop oil type notes would then infuse into the wood. The beer's emptied out, there's no liquid left in the cask, so we're not adding beer to whiskey, we're simply infusing the oak with flavour, so that when the whiskey then goes in, that's exactly what you get. So when you nose it, straight away, hopefully everybody will get almost like a light, fruity zestiness. So, so you might describe it as a hoppy type note, but a little bit of just something a bit more unusual, slightly creamy, and that's the flavour that has infused into the char layer, underneath the char layer, sitting there as things like hop oils, and just adding on top of what was already a core Glenfiddich, which would be like lovely, fruity, pear, all the characteristics you'd expect in a sort of 12-year-old Glenfiddich.
The thing for me was, because I've tried the beer as well, and when people talk about IPAs these days, they talk about these big, so often these days even hazy, but these fruity IPAs which are not very bitter. Whereas you say you went for one on steroids, you went for one which is packed, it has that bitterness, but it has those hops in there as well. It's got a wide range of hop flavors.
Yeah.
But really, one of the things I've always found about the IPA cask is the fruitiness, because you have that classically fruity Glenfiddich spirit, but the beer is, infuse some sort of strange hoppy fruitiness into the wood, which has come out in the whiskey as well.
Yeah, and that was definitely when we sat right at the concept stage. So you'll be aware, Grant's the blended whiskey. We've been doing an ale cask since 2001, and over the years we've tried lots and lots of different beers. And right at the very outset, the concept of if we were going to do an ale cask finish for Glenfiddich, what would it be? And for me, intuitively, it has to be IPA, because actually the core character of Glenfiddich is pear, grassy, almost slightly, not floral, but more like green, like geranium type notes. And then if I think of a beer, that seems pretty complementary, and therefore that was the starting point. Clearly, we had to try a few different combinations. We had to then try some different finishing periods, but fundamentally, it seemed like a fairly obvious marriage of flavour between the two drinks. Yeah,
I noticed that it's one of those ones which. Well, ever since Grant's first did the ale cask, there's been sort of occasional experiments. But since the IPA cask hit the shelves, I've seen quite a few other beer cask matured whiskies. It's sort of opened up a little bit more of a, some more people have felt the ability to experiment with it.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's a natural bedfellow, if you like, in terms of the core flavour of beer. Often does appear in spirits, in whiskey especially, because the raw material is essentially the same, the fermentation is largely the same. There's a lot of commonality. I think the key thing, and I'll probably say this a few times in the tasting, and clearly people at home can try it. Cask finish. So, for example, Glenfiddich IPA finish is not Glenfiddich and IPA beer mixed together. If anybody's got a bottle of IPA at home, take out a whiskey and pour some IPA in it, and you don't get this. What you get is very beery whiskey. What we're doing here is we're extracting the flavour of the beer into the oak. We're emptying the oak, getting rid of all the liquid, and then letting that flavour only go back into the whiskey. And that's absolutely crucial. I think sometimes there's a misconception, even when it comes to sherry cask finish and so on, that the liquid is playing a crucial part. It's absolutely not. The liquid is conditioning the cask, and the cask is then maturing the whiskey.
It's all about The thing I was talking about is it's not only is it adding flavors to the cask, not necessarily like leaving liquid behind, but it's leaving something in the cask, it's imbuing the cask with that. But it's also not so much with beer, I would say, probably because it's quite a low alcohol thing, but it's also removing stuff from the cask as well. It's taking out certain flavors. So you have like an image of what was in there beforehand, but you also have a negative of what was in there beforehand. And it's that combination I always find which sort of like affects the whiskies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Definitely. I mean, it's a standard strapline here of the previous liquid influences the oak and the oak influences the whiskey. The two liquids are basically at arm's length.
Yeah. No, that's what you want, because of course we wouldn't want to be doing any grogging or anything like that. I've read a chunk of stuff around the regulations for putting beer in whiskey casks and things like that, and it very, very quickly gets very, very complicated, and you don't want any of that. Whiskey in a beer cask, nice and easy. That's what you want. So, and there is the question, of course, I have to ask, which I have to ask every time I try this whiskey or even talk about the beer. Any further news on whether the beer might one day appear as a product on its own?
Yeah, I think there was a period of time when we thought it might. We definitely wouldn't release it as a beer. We've been down that road before with Innocent Gun, and it was great, and it was it was a great learning experience. But we make whiskey, and I think it's probably likely that that's not now going to happen. The people we're working with it's unlikely that you'll ever get the beer, I'm afraid. So you'll just have to do with the whiskey.
I've tried the beer, and it's interesting, but it's not as good as the whiskey. I'll say that. So
good.
I've got a question from Andrew from Neil and Lisa in the chat. So, are the IPA casks new, or do you use them for a few times before you put the IPA in them?
Yeah, so it's a great question. They're ex-Glenfiddich casks, so they've been used once or twice for Glenfiddich, and then the IPA beer goes in, and then after the IPA, we only use them. Well, occasionally we'll use them twice. That if you get a very, very intense note, sometimes we'll put a second fill in as well, and that we can then marry the first and second together. But yes, they're ex-Glenfiddich casks, then IPA beer, and then back to this for the cask finish.
Excellent. And from Andrew, is it available to buy? Yes, this whiskey is most definitely available to buy from the Whiskey Exchange. Thank you very much for letting me do my one bit of work plugging there. That's always good to say. No, I think we were, when it came out, I know I wrote a load about it, and we did a big focus on it. And there's, in the Zoom room, we have Tony from the Netherlands, and I had a bottle of the Project 20 as well, which I got from the launch. And I took it over to a show in the Netherlands, Malt Stock. And Tony stole it off me because he didn't have a bottle of his own at the time. So he went around using my bottle to show everybody how great the whiskies were. So, but no, so there's the beginning.
That's good. Tony's got a reputation for stealing bottles of whiskey off people. So
yeah, I won't bring him on the screen. That's what he wants us to do. So I'm not going to do that. So, but yeah, so the launch of the experimental series had, say, Project 20, which was this more sort of like sherry and wine influenced sort of thing, along with the IPA. But to move on to our next whiskey, the next entry after those two, what do we have next?
Yeah, so within the experimental series, you say we had Experiment 1 was IPA, Experiment 2 was Project 20. Then we did a small batch, Experiment 3, which was Winter Storm. And the one we're going to taste next is Fire and Cane, which is Experiment 4. And Fire and Cane, for me, it's a great example of the long-term development of whiskey and Scotch whiskey in general, because back in about 2002, 2003, we decided we wanted to start distilling peated malts. We actually did it at both Glenfiddich and Balvenie, but we'll obviously focus on Glenfiddich today. And the reason we wanted to do it was we had a huge archive full of photographs and documents and evidence that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Glenfiddich would have been using peat in the production of the spirit through the maltings at the time, and also just generally within the distillery. And a bit of research, it was pretty clear that most Speyside distillers were the same. So most Speyside distilleries at some time in their history would have been peatier, let's say, than today. So we wanted to try to, out of just interest more than anything, try to create a whiskey that perhaps would have been a style of whiskey that would have been done right back when William Grant was still around and when his family were kind of hands-on living at the distillery. And we did it with absolutely no idea what we'd ever do with it. We didn't engage with a brand team. We didn't engage with a marketing team. We simply got the permission from the family and from the kind of the board to say, yeah, just go and do that experiment. And we carried that on comfortably for 8 or 10 years with still no buy-in of why are we doing this, laying it down every year. So every year we run the Glenfiddich distillery for about a week, producing a lightly peated malt. We don't change the cut points. We simply use malted barley that's got a decent level of peating in it, and we run it through the stills. And we did a couple of limited editions, small products. We did one for the 125th anniversary. We do one for travel retail. And then Fire and Cane came along, and it's not 100% peated malt. And I'm always interested when we were doing it as a group as to who really picks up the peat, because it's supposed to be right. I'm aiming to get it right on that cusp of either you get it or you don't. And to make it even more almost of a kind of twofold whiskey is we take the whiskey, so we marry together unpeated and peated Glenfiddich. We then finish it in rum casks. Now the rum that we use is a Latin style rum, so it's quite a heavy, fairly spicy, sweet rum. Adds same principle, seasons the casks. And what I find you get is you're either in the camp of you absolutely get peat. You smell it and you get peat. You taste it, you get peat. Or if you're not so sensitive, you'll be absolutely in the other camp of saying, actually, I'm not really getting that smokiness at all. I'm getting much more of the classic Glenfiddich, slightly toffee apple, and then a deep, rich sweetness. Hence the name Fire and Cane. It's like, you're either one or the other. And it's sitting at a fairly low level of parts per million, so that it's not an absolutely obvious in-your-face peated whiskey.
Yeah, I remember when it came out, it was one of those ones where we had the story, we understood what was going on, we were told it was smoky. But I remember standing there trying it with people, and there being this debate over whether it was smoky, what was, which I find really interesting. You say, mixing peated and unpeated barleys, you get that point where it's, borderline perception. So how people sort of like reacted to that whole thing of, here's a smoky whiskey, then half of them haven't been able to taste the smoke.
Yeah, I think it depends. If you're somebody who, you love your Ardbeg and Lagavulin and you like that level of peat, you might still like this, but I suspect it's not going to deliver on the peat side. I think if you enjoy the more subtle notes, and what I find personally is I tend to taste the peat for the first couple of glasses. Let's say first couple of sips, because we'll be socially responsible here. So the first few goes at it, I definitely get peat. It disappears quite quickly for me, and then I start getting all the other things going on: the sweetness, the kind of the rum elements of it, the kind of underlying core Glenfiddich, because I think it is just on that limit where your palate gets used to it quite quickly.
The other thing I found as well, I went a bit the other way. For me, I first got something a little bit more earthy than I was expecting from Glenfiddich. Normally I expect that sort of quite meadowy, sort of, as you said earlier on, not quite floral, that sort of green meadowy sort of like character. But I got something a little bit sort of darker, a little bit on the edge of sort of earthiness, which then became, I got a little burst of smoke. Then it went into that classic Glenfiddich character, but with a bit of sort of more of a sort of toffee note as well. Those rum casks have definitely had their way as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and when we've taken it out to whiskey show, or if I'm doing consumer facing tastings, it nearly always ends up being exactly that. You very rarely have I had everybody who's on one side. You'll get somebody sitting there going, "I'm just not really getting any peat at all," and then others who are like, "Wow, this is really quite intense, smoky." And I love it for that reason. It's kind of doing what we hoped it would do. We're trying to not challenge. We're trying to just create interest in flavour and why flavour changes, and we're all different. And actually, tonight when we taste all these whiskies, we will all taste something slightly different, because that's the nature of human beings.
Yeah, and Andrew's just saying on the Zoom room, it's about toffee apples with distant smoke. And the toffee apple note was the one I really remember when I first had it. It was like it had that earthiness and then smokiness into toffee apples. And Yeah, and again, apples and pears are really a classic thing of Glenfiddich, but that lovely toffee note as well from the which I assume is from the rum casks is a lovely addition. So we've had a bit of a chat about your more experimental side and had a look at a couple of whiskies from that sort of look. So what we're trying to do now is sort of jump into your regular range, so to speak. Even with the regular range, you know, when you move beyond the 12-year-old, there's definitely something different going on in each of the different expressions. So what are we going to jump onto next?
Yeah, so we're going to actually move into the sort of more aged end of the Glenfiddich range. So we're going to move to 18-year-old. Now, it's probably one of the most common questions I get asked if I go anywhere and chatting, and then people start asking about whiskey. They'll always say, "What's your favourite?" And you know, it's like asking you what's your favourite. It's impossible. You can't really say. But if I've got a go-to Glenfiddich, if I've got a part of the range, the flavour profile that I think that kind of sums up what I like. It's the 18-year-old. It's like the slightly bigger brother of the 12. It's got a bit more intensity. It's got a bit more flavour. It's a slightly more grown-up type flavour, but fundamentally, it's got Glenfiddich written all the way through it. So if I look at the range and how we develop new products, I will always start with 12-year-old. That is the cornerstone. If we're going to make it doesn't matter what age we're going to make a new product at, we'll start at 12 because that's the comparator. You know, that's like our anchor. That's our home. And then from 12, I would describe as being fresh fruit, pear, slight hint of apple. By the time you get to 18-year-old, those lovely fresh fruit notes have just deepened, intensified, become much more like baked apple, a little bit more like stewed fruits. So it's almost like you go from fresh fruit to cooked fruit in simple terms. And then on 30-year-old, it goes all the way to dried fruit. And for me, there's a continuum that goes right through the Glenfiddich range, fruitiness all the way through it, from fresh to cooked to dried. Off of that, we hang all the different products. So what we're seeing here is this almost sits right at the very centre of our flavour map. So on the nose, it's got, I get certainly more like a baked apple pie type note. So it's got sweetness, it's got fruitiness, but it's not zingy, vibrant. It's much more kind of deep, mellow. On taste, the 18 years in a marriage, probably about 80% of it's American oak, 20% of it's Spanish oak, ex-sherry cask. So you get a lovely kind of depth of oak to it. And then one of the unique things about 18, which actually for us causes a lot of, not hassle, but it makes it complicated to produce, is it's what we call a small batch product. So every batch is bottled as an entity. Most of the kind of core range of things we'll be mixing batches together to keep consistency. Here, on the label, it'll actually tell you which batch it's from. So the challenge for myself and the team is to try and make sure we always hit the flavour profile we want, while acknowledging some batches will be slightly different. So occasionally you'll get a batch that's a bit more intense, a bit more sherried. Sometimes you'll get one that's a little bit more, American oak influence and so on. By default, I'm tasting a different one from you tonight, but I'm going to assume that everybody's tastes exactly the same because they should. And like I say, I'm getting that lovely kind of baked apple pie, bit of oakiness on the taste, and a little, almost heading towards a little bit dry initially because there's quite a bit of oak there, and then the sweetness comes through afterwards.
The thing for me is always you said that apple note, that sort of baked apples. For me, it's an apples and brown sugar. It's a point with Glenfiddich, along with other whiskies as well, but it gets this elegant sort of like combination in you. The younger ones are nice crunchy apples, and you get to this point where it's like a little bit softer now, a nice sort of brown sort of sugar toffee running through it as well. And the 18 is a point for me in the Glenfiddich range where it sort of hits that point for me. So things like the 14 and the 15, they do their own thing, but this is very much for me, as you were saying, a continuation of that Glenfiddich style.
Yeah, and I must admit, from a keeping things interesting, that it's really important because I think that the 12, 18, 30 makes such a lot of sense. It's just about aging. We're not doing anything else. Fully matured for 12 years, fully matured for 18 years, fully matured for 30 years, married together, quite traditional. But actually, if you were to do that on the 14 and the 15 and the 21, the range becomes a bit boring because it's, they're just slight increments. So it's almost like create that through the middle and then do other different things to then accentuate flavour, change flavour, add a bit of interest. Keep it recognisable Glenfiddich, because that's my absolute core ambition for all whiskies, including Fire and Cane. It must retain the core character of Glenfiddich, but do something just to make it effectively differentiate it from that absolute core of the distillery.
So I just had a question from Facebook about the concept of your core range, because you have the 12, 18, 30 range, and then you have like the 14, 15, 21, I'm trying to remember the numbers now, but the ultimate at the other end, but the American oak and things so these other ones which are sort of different variations on it, and you have the experimental range. Is there any sort of like thoughts of like bringing the experimental range, some of those things, into being more core range products, or are they things which should become more mainstream, or are they sort of fated to stay in their own little bubble?
Yeah, I think never say never on anything, because you never quite know. But I think the belief. So I definitely see my role as double, almost like looking forward and looking back. And a big part of the biggest part of what I do is maintaining the history, heritage, and almost the distillery story. And that is definitely bottled in the 12, 18, 30, the core ones, the Solera and so on. And then the other part is about exploring new things and trying to find new flavours. And that's where experimental comes in to say, well, let's not muck about with the core, and let's go and do something a little bit different. I guess over the time period that whiskey moves at, so 5, 10, 15 years time, we may well find that just consumers and whiskey lovers around the world want to move more towards that one of those styles of flavours, and therefore, yeah, it's perfectly feasible. We could bring something like that into the core range. That's definitely not the plan at the moment. The plan is to maintain the core, look after really what the distillery is all about, and then get the chance to experiment on the other expressions.
Excellent. And again, yeah, is this whole thing, if you do have this strange balance from being such a big name, the Glenfiddich 12-year-old is such a whiskey that everybody knows. It's sort of like the launching point for them to try lots of other different whiskies from within your range as well. So yeah, it's getting that balance right is well done. It sounds like it's not the easiest of things to sort out. So,
good fun.
So on the 18, I've got a comment here from Andrew again, so that water sort of like really knocks it out quite quickly. It's not a whiskey that you really want to add loads of water to. Does what it does, at the right strength already.
Yeah, I mean, I find that's a very personal thing. I would rarely drink whiskey without water, if I'm totally honest. So I'm a big supporter of people drink whiskey the way they want to drink it. Certainly from sitting here in this room, I would be taking all my whiskies down to probably lower than most people here would want to drink whiskey. I would take it all down to 28% ABV and be nosing and tasting it at that strength, very much from a quality control point of view, making sure everything's okay. At home, I would still add a drop of water to 18. So I like the just breaking the little bit of bite it's got and turning it into something a little bit softer. But that is a very, very personal thing. So I'm always happy to go with whatever people enjoy. They should do it.
I'm always somebody who adds a little bit of water to every whiskey I try, if I'm ever going to be able to try it again. Right. If I can have a chance to experiment, I'll have a chance to experiment. I'll have a play. But yeah, otherwise, we'll see how it goes. So excellent. So 18-year-old. Should we move on to our next whiskey?
Yeah, absolutely.
So shifting again outside of the sort of that normal trajectory, what are we jumping onto now?
So we're going to now try the 21, and this really follows on from a previous comment. If it's 21-year-old Glenfiddich, obviously fully matured in a combination of American and Spanish oak, and in a relatively traditional way. But actually, as soon as you nose it, you can tell it's not just 3 years older than Glenfiddich 18. If anything, it's actually a little bit lighter in style, and definitely for me, significantly sweeter. So way more vanilla, way more of those toffee, creamy, almost little hints of banana on the nose. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the whiskey maturation itself is a little bit different, whereby we normally, the normal kind of rule of thumb is the older you get, the more sherry wood you put in. Just a little bit more oak, a little bit more intensity, put a bit more European or Spanish oak in. On Glenfiddich 21, we do the opposite way around. So we drop the level of sherry cask in there down a lot. So it goes down below 10%. So it's there to add a texture and a complexity, but it's not the biggest single part. So there's a lot of American oak in there, and that's really given us, a huge vanilla hit. It's then also got a rum cask finish. Now we use a different type of rum cask for the 21 than we do for the Fire and Cane. The 21 is much more in the style of a golden Caribbean fruity style rum. And for everybody, a lot of people here will know this anyway, but back in the early 2000s, when we were looking to start doing rum cask finishes in-house, and we tried various experiments. David was obviously leading everything at that point, and we really struggled to get a consistent rum cask. We struggled to find a consistent supply of casks that always delivered the same results. So what we did is we decided we would make our own rum casks. So we actually, rather than bring casks from the Caribbean to Scotland, we bring rum from the Caribbean to Dufftown, and we mature the rum on site, and we create basically Dufftown rum casks. So we buy a very consistent rum and then mature it in casks that have gone through our own cooperage. And what we find there is the infusion of the rum into the actual ex-bourbons really accentuates that vanilla, adds a little bit of the kind of top note that you get at the top of your nose, the kind of real zestiness, and then just accentuates the flavour up just a little bit. So the 21-year-old Glenfiddich is already creamy, toffee, vanilla, and then a little bit more because there's a rum cask finish on top.
So that rum, the inevitable question: well, what happens to it after you finish playing with it in Dufftown?
Yeah, so we use it multiple times, so we can move it on casks quite a few times, and then a variety of things. We have on occasion sold it back to the rum blender who we source it from, because actually they end up with quite a different flavour profile because it's been through casks so many times in a period of time. Or we've blended it into other rum products we've got, and or we get another blend on top and we basically keep it moving. So it's a bit like a big rum bodega that occasionally things come out, but mostly it's just about continually seasoning the casks in Dufftown.
Excellent. I was very lucky and I once tried it, and yeah, it's definitely it's a bit of a strange rum. I remember the one I tried was a slightly green colour in a particularly strange sort of fashion. A friend of mine described it as looking like Disney poison. Tasted pretty good though. Cool. So I've got a question actually from, just before I forget about it, from what's his name again? Sorry, from Graham over on Facebook. And he was just wondering, he was the guy who was asking beforehand about bits and pieces, but he also wanted to know, do you have any cask strength stuff sort of on the horizon? So I know you occasionally do cask strength releases. Do you have a sort of more regular cask strength expressions anywhere in the plans?
Not so many at in the sort of what you might call the core range. We do have some cask strength whiskies. We do, it's not cask strength as such, but we do the Glenfiddich 15 at higher strength, so 51%. If you go way back in the annals of time, it used to be called Glenfiddich cask strength, and then obviously all the rules and regulations changed on that in terms of what that really means. So that it sits at 51%. One of the difficulties we've got on the core range is really the sheer breadth of markets it's going to, making if you do cask strength, as you know from some of the bottling you're doing, every batch has a different label then, because you're, where are you coming in? So we're definitely doing more at differing strengths, and we're going to take the very last one tonight is a cask strength. So I'd say small limited edition batches, yes, probably will see some cask strengths. Core global products, much less likely to be cask strength. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll be 40, but probably be somewhere that's a consistent, always reduced to this strength.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I spoke to Armagnac producers who bottle, like part casks, batches at a time, and just the perils of trying to change your label every single time you do a bottling is awful. So, but on the 21, again, for me, on the sort of the palate of it, that rum influence, it's a finish. It's not like a massive, huge pile of flavour. As you're saying, it adds that definite rum influence. It definitely sort of rounds out things, adds a bit of toffee, everything like that, which shows a very different side of Glenfiddich, away from that sort of grassy sort of side that you normally have. So you play around with rum casks for this, but do you have, what sort of other casks do you have sort of hiding away in the wings? And are there any particular ones which you think really complement Glenfiddich outside of rum and sherry and the normal things?
Yeah, I suppose it's always a tricky one. The simple answer is yes, we've got lots. Are the things we're going to talk about? Probably not so much. But the cask that I'm probably most interested in at the moment, in terms of that I'm getting the most fun with them, is the sheer diversity of wine casks. There's such a massive range, and generally speaking, they work. Generally speaking, you get good flavour. The reason they work, and it's going to be very relevant to the next whiskey, but to tee it up, is that wine casks fundamentally are just full of flavour, because wine matures at anything between probably 12 and 15% ABV, therefore has a very large amount of water in it. Whiskey matures at typically 55 plus, so has a very large amount of alcohol in it. And the flavours that the wine is removing from the cask versus the flavour that the whiskey is removing from the cask is totally different. So what I tend to find is a wine cask arrives, it's got the added benefit of it's been infused with wine, so there's some flavours that have been left behind, but actually the active part of the oak that the whiskey is genuinely interested in is almost untouched. So they sort of behave as virgin oak. They almost behave like they've never had anything removed from them, and if anything, a little bit added. So the amount of diversity of flavour, we've got some truly stunning wine casks tucked away. Now, we might again never release them, because that then partly depends, well, does it fit, and is it part of the range, and can we tell a story, and is it of the right kind of flavour profile that we want to release, because it might taste amazing, but it might not fully represent Glenfiddich. So some of them we just keep, and people like Tony and myself just drink them, and then others we actually bottle them.
Well, tying into that, Mark Dermal over on Facebook has just sort of said he just finished with the Storm last night and he really liked it. Brilliant whiskey. We're just wondering, is there going to be another batch of that? Because I know you've done a few already. Is there going to be another one?
I don't think so. Never say never. It might appear, but Winter Storm, I loved making it. Very difficult in terms of anybody who's aware of the Canadian ice wine industry. Incredibly small, and to get the cask out of that industry wasn't easy. It was easy insofar as we had a great partner, and they did everything they could to help us. But the scale at which we wanted to do the experimental release was hard to match up with such a small industry. So hence it ended up being 2 relatively small batches, and I think we'll probably just call it a day at that and move on to the future experiments.
So I remember hearing about it beforehand and nobody really knowing what it was. We just had the name. There are many theories, and but then it came out and it sold out so quickly. And it was that first batch. It's a quite different style. Again, with all of these things, when you're using finishes, doing experimental things, it changes that style. And very, very, very sweet, sort of like added sort of extra element from the ice wine. But yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not going to see another one, because that's the one we get asked about probably most when it comes to Glenfiddich releases at the moment. It's not only Mark, it's other people sort of asking around whether there's going to be another release of it. And a question from Albert, Jan, Dennis, and Bernard, I don't know, over on the Zoom room. Any plans to play around with mezcal casks? That seems to be the thing everybody else does.
Yeah, mezcal is fascinating. We've definitely looked at it. I don't think in the short term we're going to do anything. Probably for similar reasons as I talked about on rum. Mezcal is slightly tricky. Getting consistent mezcal casks isn't easy. It tends to be lots of small producers, a lot of diversity of cask. Not the easiest casks to get, and certainly not the easiest casks to get in a consistent manner. So a fun thing to play about with. Probably not necessarily one that you'll see any Glenfiddich anytime soon.
But if you're really lucky and come to see you sometime, there might be a little sample bottle on the side. Okay, I can see how.
Possibly.
Oh dear. So, what are we moving on to next after the 21?
Yeah, so it's almost as if I planned this and started talking about wine casks beforehand, but we're actually going to move on to the Grand Cru 23-year-old, and this is it's probably the last significant launch we've had before lockdown, and clearly at the moment we have a few things in the pipeline, but they've all been pushed out. So Grand Cru is a 23-year-old Glenfiddich, matured in what we call a cuvee cask, which is a fancy name for a wine cask from France. It's from a very specific region of France, and the reason I'm interested in it is because of the style of wine that was in before, in terms of the way that wine interacts with the oak. So if we go back to this premise of liquid influences oak, oak influences whiskey, for Grand Cru, the wine that goes in there is really quite acidic, and therefore the chemistry of that wine and the oak is a little bit different to other styles of wine, and you create flavours that I don't wholly know where they come from. I don't wholly know the chemistry of where the flavour comes from, but when we've experimented with lots and lots of different wine casks, that style of wine definitely creates almost like a sweetness, a patisserie type note, a little bit yeasty, a little bit, I think in the taste notes we refer to it as brioche, and for me that sort of sums it up. It's got like a bread note but with a sweetness on top, so almost like that brioche sweetness. Similar principle, the Glenfiddich 23 is matured in a combination of American and Spanish oak. Actually beautifully rounded in its own right, would happily be an expression, but the cuvee cask finish just elevates it a little bit, and you get that buttery, sweet brioche note that I don't think you could simply get from the Scotch itself. So reasonably subtle. I said earlier about drinking whiskey, and I would nearly always add water. This is one of the exceptions in the Glenfiddich range. I find just at bottling strength, it doesn't taste as strong as it is. It's very, very soft, just disappears like a palate. So I tend to just drink this one as it comes.
I remember one of the things I've noticed you've done there, you very, very carefully avoided discussing what that wine in those casks and what it might become in the future.
Yes, and I'll continue to do that, yes.
Okay. Am I allowed to tell people what might happen to that wine in the future? It might become fizzy. That's all I will tell you. It might become... It's the sort of wine which occasionally may become a famous fizzy French wine. But yes, we'll go no further than that. I remember trying to explain to people what this was, and as soon as you mentioned the mysterious French wine that I'm very deliberately not saying, things get very confused. So, as you say, this was, when it comes to Glenfiddich, which is generally quite an elegant whiskey anyway, when you sort of look at it, it's not a big sort of like brash hit you in the face sort of whiskey. This one was very, very much even more than normal, very, very delicate, very elegant, very, very subtle, with quite a lot going on still. And those casks, I remember hearing and speaking to Mark Thompson, Scottish Brand Ambassador, about it. He was saying that actually the casks were quite aggressive and gave it quite a lot of flavour, and you had to sort of do some playing with them to try and make sure it didn't overwhelm the whiskey.
Yeah, and the same principle. Occasionally we'll use the cask twice. So occasionally we'll do a first pass finish, and then we'll put more Glenfiddich in for a second fill, and merge them together. If it's because I'm hugely passionate across all our ranges. Actually, I don't think cask finishes should dominate your whiskey. I don't think that's the purpose of them. I learned from David, obviously, and David over the years developed cask finishes, and in the 80s, Balvenie was kind of paving the way and almost explaining what a cask finish was. And it's about adding a sheen, a polish, an elevation, a subtlety to the final whiskey. It shouldn't be the dominant factor, and therefore, we definitely always play around making sure that the core whiskey is absolutely central to everything we're doing, and then the cask finish is just about adding that delicacy, the sort of subtlety of change of flavour. And definitely with this, I don't want that patisserie type note that I've described to be overpowering. I want it to be there where you almost like subtlety, where I've suggested it. Hopefully people are now going, oh yeah, actually I do get something. I maybe wasn't able to describe it, but I get the fact that there's just that little touch of sweetness there.
Yeah, and I think, as you're saying, that's what you talk about, bready notes. For me, it definitely came across as this light yeasty sort of thing, and that not in a bad way. I like that sort of thing, especially in beers and things like that, when you get that yeast character itself. And in whiskey, generally, it will disappear during distillation. It may appear in fermentation, but disappear later on. And this brings back some of that character, and again, that flavour which might be lost during production. I found it just very, very interesting when I tried it. It was just unlike any other Glenfiddich, but at the same time, distinctly a Glenfiddich, which it's an interesting balancing act to do. However, is it part of a range, or is it a sort of thing on its own at the moment? So I heard rumours there might be more things along the same sorts of lines coming out down the line.
Yeah, so it's going to be part of a range. So we're slightly behind the curve of where we'd hope to be, but the name is Grand Cru, and we've already got a Grand Reserve, which we've just tasted, which is the 21. So we are going to end up with a range of expressions of Glenfiddich that really sit together in terms of the look, the feel. So you'll have the core, and then you have what we refer to as the Grand range, where even just the packaging looks quite different. The Grand Cru pack, as you know, is the kind of iconic stag and so on, but just visibly looking different. Clearly, that's not my world at all in terms of the marketing side, but just the way that we're going to market the whiskey and elevate the luxury status, if you like. So there is more to come. It's not coming quite as quickly as we'd hoped. The whiskey's actually already. It's about everybody else being ready, basically.
Yeah, it's been a lot of things being slightly delayed recently. I can't imagine why that might be. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I just have a check of my notes, but back in last September was when I tried the Grand Cru at the release. And I've been still sitting around since then going, what's the next one? And there was definitely a lot of people sitting there trying to work out what the next thing you're going to, if you do the same thing with a finish, it's like, what mysterious thing we'll be finishing with. So I look forward to seeing what that might be a little bit further down the line. So,
I had to make sure, as I got the room ready, I had to make sure I looked around. There was no stray bottles in the background that you're not supposed to see, but I think I cleared it all.
Well, if anybody wants to zoom in, I'm recording a nice high-res version for later on as well, so you can see what we can see. So shall we move on to another whiskey?
Yeah, so we're going to move on to the final one for this session. It's not necessarily the final one of the night. You're all welcome to drink as much as you like, just responsibly, obviously. But hold on to your hat for this one, because this is pretty special in terms of its uniqueness, but also I need to put a big health warning at the start about the ABV. So it's sitting up at a full 65% ABV. And there's a reason for that, where it's a single cask, and it was actually bottled exclusively for the Spirit of Speyside Festival 2020. But as everybody knows, that festival never actually happened. So for the past, I think it's about 10 years, every year we select a cask that is only available at the distillery during the festival. We sell it as an exclusive, as a lock-up. Anybody who visits gets a chance to buy it. And we always try and make it interesting. So over the years, we've had some peated Glenfiddich single cask. We've had a port cask, a quarter Hudson cask, sherry butts. And there's always trying to pick something. And so we're well underway this year about finding a cask for this year, when clearly world started to change, and the Speyside Whisky Festival was obviously called off, and originally, I think it was actually originally just cancelled, but certainly postponed and then cancelled. And we had a bit of a get together with the team at Glenfiddich and decided that actually we'd still like to make this cask available. The difference being all the proceeds of the sale was going to go to charity, and very specifically to 3 Speyside charities, because clearly everybody here is very aware Speyside's an area that's heavily reliant on whiskey, and second to that, very reliant on visitors and people visiting distilleries or just the general locality, and that all took a massive hit. So we bottled 450 bottles. It's a second use sherry butt, so it's had Glenfiddich in it once before. This is its second use, which means when you nose it, and it's worth nosing it at full strength, but it really is too strong, to be totally honest. It's definitely worth tasting it at full strength, but it's definitely too strong. So taste it, let it evaporate in your mouth. Don't swallow it. Let it evaporate in your mouth for quite a while. It will be quite hot. Slowly as it evaporates away, that sweetness will start to appear. I'm not going to taste it because I'm actually driving home, so trust me to do it. But just let it evaporate. Let the wood flavour start to appear, and you'll just see it getting sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And that's, it's just a function of the amount of alcohol there disappears, and the sheer intensity of the flavour comes out. So the end result is we did a partnership with Whisky Auctioneer. We sold all 450 bottles and they kindly also donated the commission fee from the sale. So all in all, £240,000 went to the Speyside charities for this one-off edition,
which is really impressive. With the the turnaround time of it and everything as well, because the whole of the whole lockdown thing hit everybody pretty quickly, and so I know you had the whiskey almost ready to go, but at the same time, Whiskey Auctioneer have done some great work on doing some sort of bits and pieces like this. So the whiskey itself, again, you say it's too strong, and entirely understand. It has that massive hit and from that. So why release it at this strength? What is it about cask strength whiskeys do you reckon it is that people want so very much?
I think I can't really speak for the people who want them, but I think what they want is they want the experience of being in this room. They want the experience of being at a distillery and having the choices, and to almost feel that they're touching and experiencing a cask. And that's the closest a lot of people will get. And I completely understand it. I think as a drinking experience, for me personally, it's too strong. But as a dipping your toe or looking behind the curtain and seeing into the whiskey production process, it's absolutely fantastic, because you get, it's very real. And certainly all the casks we've ever done for the Spirit of Speyside, we've always just done them at cask strength and said, look, they're for connoisseurs, they're for people who know whiskey, they're for people exactly on this call who totally get it. It's not an everyday for everybody drinking whiskey, because the intensity of the alcohol and the intensity of the flavour is a bit much. But the beauty of it is you can just slowly add water to the point where you feel it's right for you.
And that's one of the things that for me, that is the big thing about cask strength whiskies, is that you have that choice, because from day to day, you're never entirely sure what you're really going to want to drink. And so having that ability to have something a bit stronger than normal, or a bit, bit lighter than normal is always great. But also just so you can see the range of flavors that develop as you add water to it. Because, the same moment it's quite intense like that, but as you add the water, it will reveal lots of different bits and pieces as it sort of, calms down.
Yeah, definitely. And from my own experience of this one, I think, full strength, it's fun and it's a bit zingy and sherbety and intense. As you're adding water, I think there's an orange zestiness comes out where it gets a little bit citrus. It's a bit of a no-brainer. It's got oakiness, but it's got that. It's not full-on raisin dried fruit sherry. It's a lot more like candied peel. It's got the sweetness and the citrus and the kind of tannin all coming together in a really nice way, and it does evolve. And if you get it down to closer into the even just closer to 50%, then and the intensity in the palate goes, then suddenly you just get a lot of flavour developing.
And that's one of the things about refill casks, because you said this is a refill sherry cask rather than one of those first fills. And it's something that I know a load of people just talk about casks and everybody wants really dark sherry all the time. But my favourite casks are always the refills. So something like this, where you get those sherry characters, but you still have that flavour of Glenfiddich still coming through, and it's not swamped. You can still taste where it's from. And, for your range especially, it's an important thing to always be able to taste the Glenfiddich all the way through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like this definitely helps out. So,
yeah, definitely. And the key thing, when we select casks for the Speyside Whisky Festival, probably more than ever, it's a single cask. You do get such a variety. You get so many, such a range of flavours. Going to a warehouse, 100 casks filled on the same day, 100 different flavour profiles within the extent of the distillery character. But it's really important we pick something that is recognisable Glenfiddich. And sometimes the issue with a first fill sherry cask is the cask becomes just too dominant. So you end up with, it's a sherry bomb, it's big, it's intense, it's dark, and actually you'd start to see this could come from a very large number of distilleries, where here the balance of distillery to cask is still in the place of saying, yeah, it's Glenfiddich. And then it's got those other flavours on top.
And this is the thing I like about the whiskies we tried tonight, and it's one of those things that people often miss when talking about Glenfiddich, is the fact that they've tried the 12-year-old, and the 12-year-old, great whiskey though it is, it's very much what it is. It's a nice everyday dram. It does its thing. It has the Glenfiddich character, there's so much more that you do, which people don't often see so much, because the 12 sort of like, eclipses everything. And so to be able to try something like this one, which is definitely still Glenfiddich, at the same time as having, high strength and something a little bit different. If I say, Glenfiddich 12-year-old was one of my first whiskies I tried back when it was a 12-year-old the first time round, I think. Maybe an 8-year-old, I can't remember. And Andrew is sort of saying here, his first whiskey 32 years ago was a Glenfiddich. So it's one of those ones which sort of pops up and sort of goes around for many, many years. But the thing my first tasting I did when I was about to start in the whiskey industry was a Glenfiddich tasting. And I sat down with brand ambassador at the time, Jamie Milne, who went through it with me and explained how Glenfiddich worked. And it was that point, it was very much the whiskey industry is not quite what I thought it is. Oh, it is different. Oh, there is more stuff to do. So I've been really, really pleased to be able to try some of these whiskies, which sort of show a different side to what you guys do.
Yeah, great. And I thoroughly agree. I think, I think the complexity, and it's not just for us, it's for every distillery, the complexity across flavour and the differentiation you can make in ages through casks and recipes. That's why we end up in group chats like this, because it's such a diversity that exists within the whole industry, never mind one single distillery.
Yeah. Well, I've got one question and then one obligatory question, which not every distillery, but for some reason I always seem to ask you whenever I sort of see. So first things first, I got a question from Facebook from Joel Marks, who says, have you got any more rich oak stuff coming along? Because that was one he really liked, and it seems to have fallen out of the main range.
Rich oak. Yeah, so we stopped bottling rich oak. There's still some around. I don't know if you've got any. If you want another plug.
I didn't realise you stopped bottling it, so I think we've probably got a few bottles around, but it might be on its way out now.
Yeah, it sounds like the price has just gone up too.
I'll try and keep it away from the boss, don't worry. He won't realise yet.
But no, we stopped bottling it a year or two ago. We have a different expression which is pretty similar, but and it was exclusive in the US, which is called Bourbon Barrel Reserve, where rich oak was a combination of virgin Spanish and virgin American oak married together. The Bourbon Barrel Reserve focuses entirely on the American oak, so they're basically barrels that would have gone to the bourbon industry. We do a cast finish on it, so it's a bit more in the straightforward big vanilla, toffee, creamy notes, rather than the deep oakiness, and that one is around, but the rich oak's not anymore. Yeah,
and of course the final question. I'm not going to be boring and just say what do you have coming next. What can we expect? What can we? When will we expect things? Now I know you said there's stuff which has been delayed, and what sort of area of your quite wide range are we looking at for the new things that are coming down the line at the moment? If you can.
Yeah, so definitely more in the Grand series. We've got the 23 that we tried tonight. There's more imminent in that, and I think we are getting to the place where that probably will happen this year. It's just a little bit up in the air exactly how and when and so on, and clearly it'll mean people not travelling and so on, that type of thing. So definitely more there, and then definitely more in experimental series. We've got a lot of experiments sitting there that are ready to go. That the timeline and that's a little bit harder. I would have said confidently next year, but I think there's a possibility it might move into 2022 just through logistics and getting things actually up and moving. But they're probably the two areas that will have most activity in Glenfiddich in the next couple of years.
Excellent. So new range and lots more experiments, which sounds good to me. So as long as you still have the core Glenfiddich there, sitting there and fulfilling all the other bits and pieces we're after, that sounds like a really good thing. So, well, thank you very much, Brian, for coming along this evening and sharing your knowledge and also letting us try these fantastic whiskies, especially the Spirit of Speyside, which is something which I never thought I'd get a taste of. So thank you very much.
That's all. Thank you for inviting me along. It's good. It's nice to sit in the office a wee bit later in the evening and actually just chat about whiskey for a change.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody who's joined us on Facebook, and thank you very much to everybody who is sitting here in the Zoom room.